In the winter of 1943, a German intelligence officer in neutral Sweden received a report so absurd that he nearly dismissed it on sight. It came through commercial channels, an intercepted trade communique from the United States, and it claimed that the Ford Motor Company, the builder of Model Ts and farm trucks, had transformed one of its car factories into an aircraft plant. The document's final line was brief, almost casual. Current rate, 1 bomber per hour. When the report reached Berlin, analysts read it aloud in disbelief. 1 per hour? They repeated the phrase, half laughing, half irritated. Even Hitler, briefed on the claim during a late-night staff meeting, waved it away with a grin. Propaganda, he said. American boasting. For in the German mind, industry was still measured by craft, men with precision tools, master mechanics adjusting tolerances by hand. The notion that an automobile company could mass-produce bombers sounded like something from a fever dream. But weeks later, photographs arrived, grainy, high-altitude images captured by a reconnaissance plane flying from the Atlantic. They showed an expanse of roof shimmering under the Michigan sun, a structure so vast that its edges faded into farmland. One building, nearly a mile long. Its shape was unnatural, a single continuous rectangle, interrupted only by vents and skylights that glinted like a field of mirrors. At first, analysts thought it was a montage, several factories spliced together. It wasn't. It was Willow Run. Inside, additional sources confirmed, assembly lines ran the entire length of the building. Conveyors, cranes, scaffolds, and workers by the thousands. Aerial photos revealed doors at both ends, with completed aircraft rolling out as raw aluminum entered the other side. The scale defied comprehension. It was as if the age of handcraft had ended overnight. The laughter in Berlin stopped. What began as a rumor had solidified into a photograph, a single image that made no sense in the logic of European warfare. For Germany, war was the domain of engineers. For America, it was becoming the domain of factories. And somewhere deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, unease replaced amusement. Because if the report was true, if Ford really could build a bomber every hour, then the war had already begun to turn. In early 1942, the farmland west of Detroit began to vanish beneath concrete. Tractors gave way to bulldozers, orchards to steel. Within months, a structure rose from the frozen ground so vast that local farmers called it the building that ate the fields. Its name was Willow Run. At its peak, it would cover 67 acres, the largest single-roof factory on Earth. From above, it resembled an airstrip folded into a box, a mile-long assembly line that ran straight through the building, turned, and looped back again. Henry Ford's engineers called it the most ambitious experiment in industrial history, a place where bombers would be built like automobiles. For decades, Ford had preached the gospel of repetition. That motion itself could create precision. Now, with the world at war, he intended to prove it on a scale that defied imagination. The mission was simple in theory and almost impossible in practice: to build one B-24 Liberator every 60 minutes. Skeptics mocked the idea. Airplanes were handcrafted machines, the product of fitters, riveters, and specialists who worked by feel, not formula. Planes are not cars, the experts insisted. They pointed to the thousands of unique parts, the tight tolerances, the hand-adjusted seams that no conveyor could replicate. Even within the U.S. military, doubts spread quietly. Many believed Ford's dream would collapse beneath its own ambition. The first months seemed to prove them right. Engines jammed on the line, hydraulic systems leaked, workers, overwhelmed by complexity, quit faster than they were hired. Assembly halts became routine. Deadlines slipped from days to weeks. The factory's echoing halls, built for triumph, became monuments to frustration. But Ford refused to yield. "If it can be built once," he told his foreman, "it can be built 1,000 times." His engineers rewrote the process piece by piece, replacing judgment with jigs and skill with sequence. Slowly, order began to emerge from chaos. The factory that had devoured fields now devoured obstacles, and as its long line crawled toward rhythm, few yet realized what was being born there. Not just bombers, but a new kind of warfare. A war fought not by armies in trenches, but by machines in motion. By the summer of 1943, the chaos at Willow Run had hardened into rhythm. Conveyor belts that once stuttered now hummed. Workers who once hesitated now moved like clockwork, thousands of hands shaping one idea into motion. In the glass rafters above them, sunlight caught the endless stream of aluminum and rivets, transforming the factory floor into a river of metal. And then, one morning, the impossible happened. A fully assembled B-24 Liberator rolled off the line. Wings spread, engines mounted, guns fitted, fuel tanks sealed. 63 minutes later, another followed. Not a prototype, not a display model, a complete combat-ready bomber. Ford's promise had become reality. One plane every hour. What Europe had dismissed as propaganda had become arithmetic. The skies above Detroit filled with sound. Test pilots climbed into each new machine, throttling up through the haze. The roar of radial engines echoed across the Great Lakes as formations of silver bombers rose from Michigan farmland like flocks of mechanical birds. The city that once built cars now built air power, and the transformation was total. From across the Atlantic, German intelligence officers stared at the photographs and production numbers in disbelief. Their own factories were hidden underground, buried beneath rock and camouflage, struggling under bombardment. They built in darkness. America built in daylight. Even under full alert, Germany could not match the speed of a single plant on the edge of Detroit. It was as if an entire nation had become an engine. Analysts in Berlin tried to calculate the meaning. The math was brutal. For every bomber the Luftwaffe destroyed, 10 more took its place. The numbers had stopped behaving like numbers. They had become a weapon, one measured not in precision, but in repetition. "They have turned war into industry," one German report concluded. It was meant as an accusation, but it read like an epitaph. And as the sound of engines echoed from the factories of America to the skies of Europe, the shape of the war began to change. One bomber, 1 hour, at a time. Before the war, Germany had turned engineering into a religion. Precision was not just a standard, it was a creed. In the workshops of Augsburg and Bremen, men in white coats measured tolerances to the thousandth of an inch, polishing aluminum skins by hand until they shone like mirrors. Aircraft were built not on lines, but on benches, each one adjusted, tuned, and balanced by craftsmen who saw in machinery the reflection of the nation itself. A Messerschmitt was not assembled, it was sculpted, and every rivet carried the pride of mastery. To outsiders, it looked invincible. The Luftwaffe's planes were faster, lighter, and more refined than anything the Allies could field. Their engines purred with mechanical grace, their control surfaces moved like instruments, not weapons. But perfection, as it often does, carried a hidden price. Every aircraft took too long. Every adjustment required another hand, another hour. Excellence was slow. Precision, for all its glory, could not multiply. When the bombing began, that flaw became fatal. Allied raids struck at daylight, forcing production deeper underground. Aircraft assembly lines splintered into bunkers, tunnels, and caves. Each Messerschmitt or Fokker-Wulf that emerged was a triumph of skill and a symbol of exhaustion. The very quality that defined German engineering was now strangling it. Factories built for craft could not survive a war of scale, and yet in Berlin, the faith remained unshaken. Reports of America's vast consumer plants, of Detroit's endless rows of machinery, of Ford's so-called airplane factory, were dismissed with a smile. "They build toys," one official scoffed. "We build weapons." To the German High Command, the idea of an assembly line producing aircraft by the hundreds was laughable. Machines, they believed, required craftsmen. They could not be left to motion, to rhythm, to automation. But across the Atlantic, that rhythm had already begun. What Germany saw as chaos, America saw as capacity. The same nation that had once mass-produced automobiles was now retooling to mass-produce bombers. Where Germany had mastered perfection, America had mastered repetition. And repetition, relentless, tireless, and mechanical, would soon prove the stronger faith. The German engineers could not yet see it, but their greatest strength had already become their greatest weakness. While they worshipped precision in dimly lit tunnels, the factories of Detroit were learning to flood the sky. And in that unseen contest, between the craftsman and the conveyor, the future of modern warfare was quietly being decided. Long before the war, before the roar of aircraft engines replaced the hum of automobiles, Henry Ford had already rewritten the logic of labor. In 1913, at his Highland Park plant, he introduced a single idea that would alter the century: the moving assembly line. Cars no longer stood still while men worked around them. Instead, the work itself began to move. Each task was divided, each motion simplified, until production became rhythm, a choreography of bolts, belts, and human hands. What others saw as repetition, Ford saw as revelation. Precision, he believed, did not come from perfection, but from movement. To Ford, industry was not chaos or conquest. It was order. Every product was proof that discipline could transform complexity into something ordinary enough to drive home. When he spoke of his factories, he spoke as others did of orchestras. "Each man has one note to play," he said, "and the song is efficiency." It was an art form built not of beauty, but of predictability, precision through motion. In peace, it built prosperity. In war, it would build power. When President Roosevelt stood before Congress in 1940 and called for 50,000 planes a year, a number that stunned even his own advisors, Ford did not hesitate. "We'll find a way," he said. It was less a boast than a creed. He had spent a lifetime proving that the impossible was simply the unstandardized. Where others saw an engineering challenge, Ford saw a scheduling problem. The task fell to Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, a man known for his iron temperament and his ability to turn dreams into diagrams. Sorensen and his engineers began to translate the language of automobiles into the grammar of aviation. Every part was catalogued, numbered, and standardized. Where aircraft factories once relied on artisans to shape and fit each piece by hand, Ford divided the B-24 into 55,000 operations, each one teachable, repeatable, and timed to the second. The bomber, once a symbol of craftsmanship, was about to become a product of system. To train the army of workers who would make it real, Ford turned to tools of his own invention: film strips, manuals, and stopwatches. New hires learned not from masters, but from movies. Men and women, many who had never set foot in a factory before, were taught to build engines with the same precision they once used to peel apples or fix bicycles. Each movement had purpose. Each pause had reason. What emerged on the floor was not chaos, but choreography. By the time Willow Run opened, it was clear that Ford had done more than build a factory. He had built a philosophy, one that believed motion itself could manufacture power. In his mind, war would not be won by bravery or invention, but by organization. The machine had become the method, and in that quiet shift, Henry Ford had already changed the way the world would fight. But even the prophet of motion could not foresee how his own creation would soon exceed every human scale, and how Germany, still clinging to perfection, would learn what efficiency truly meant. In the neutral ports of South America, ships still carried mail and rumor between worlds at war. It was there, in the coded chatter of consulates and cargo manifests, that German agents first heard the phrase, "airplane convoys leaving Detroit." The words made little sense. Detroit was the city of Fords and Buicks, of sedans and farm trucks, not of bombers, yet the reports persisted. New aircraft leaving Michigan in formation, bound for training bases in the American Midwest. To Berlin's intelligence analysts, it sounded like fantasy. Factories could build parts, perhaps, but entire bomber convoys? Impossible. When the cables reached the Reich Air Ministry, the experts laughed. "More American propaganda," they said. "He builds cars, not bombers." In the German imagination, aircraft could only be produced in specialized facilities, hand-assembled by craftsmen with years of apprenticeship. The notion that Henry Ford's assembly lines could churn out warplanes as they once had Model Ts seemed absurd. The Reich had its own myths about American industry. Vast, inefficient, wasteful. It did not believe that chaos could yield order. Even within the United States, skepticism ran deep. Army Air Corps officers visited Willow Run and left unconvinced. The building was colossal, yes, but the workers were inexperienced, the machinery unfamiliar, and the process untested. "It will collapse under its own ambition," one observer wrote. "Mass production belongs to cars, not combat." But outside their offices, the factory was growing faster than disbelief could keep up. By 1942, Willow Run had become a living organism. 42,000 workers swarmed its corridors, half of them new to industry. Buses brought them from towns miles away, depositing wave after wave of men and women in uniforms of denim and oil. The plant ran around the clock. At night, its windows glowed white against the Michigan dark, a beacon of glass and steam visible for miles across the frozen plains. Local farmers called it the light that never sleeps. Inside, the air was thick with sound. The clang of presses, the hiss of welders, the low hum of motion that never stopped. Somewhere within that noise, a rhythm was forming, the rhythm of an assembly line learning to build wings instead of wheels. And when, at last, the first completed B-24 rolled out under its own power, the skeptics fell silent. It wasn't theory anymore, it was aluminum, riveted and real, lifting off into the morning haze. News of the flight spread quickly, not through headlines, but through whispers. Workers stood outside to watch it disappear into the clouds, knowing they had witnessed something larger than a test. In that moment, the age of the craftsman gave way to the age of motion. A new kind of power had been born, one not of genius, but of system. And far across the ocean, the spies who once laughed at their intercepted reports began to listen more carefully. For if a car maker could truly mass-produce bombers, then the war's balance was about to change, not on the battlefield, but on the factory floor. In the beginning, Willow Run refused to cooperate. What looked perfect on paper collapsed under the weight of reality. Airplanes were not automobiles. They demanded tolerances far beyond what car tooling could sustain. Early on, fuselage panels refused to align, wing mounts warped under their own weight, and engines jammed during installation. Workers who once built sedans now faced blueprints written in a language they barely understood. The first attempts at full assembly bordered on chaos. Dozens of incomplete bombers scattered across the floor like broken promises. Precision had always been a matter of judgment, of touch, of instinct, of the experienced eye. But Ford's system had no patience for judgment. It sought to remove it entirely. Engineers began to redesign the tools themselves. Jigs that positioned parts without human guesswork, fixtures that forced alignment, gauges that measured what the hand could not. They called it precision by default. Where a craftsman once made decisions, a mechanism now did. The human became part of the system, not its master. Slowly, chaos began to resolve into order. Each error corrected became a lesson multiplied thousands of times. Subassemblies were redesigned to move along conveyors, wings on one line, fuselages on another, meeting at timed intersections like clockwork. Forklifts, cranes, and railcars turned the factory floor into a landscape of motion. From above, it looked like a living organism, a mechanical bloodstream pulsing through miles of concrete arteries. The workers themselves adapted. Confusion gave way to rhythm, rhythm to pride. Many had never seen an airplane before joining Willow Run. Now they could identify a B-24 by sound alone. Cafeterias served 20,000 meals a day. Bus convoys carried workers 30 miles each way from dormitories and hastily built housing. At night, the parking lots glittered with the headlights of shift changes, the steady heartbeat of a city that existed only to build. Ford's supervisors began to speak of the plant as if it were alive, a civilization of motion governed by schedules instead of laws. The work never stopped. Even when snow blanketed the runways, assembly continued beneath the warm glare of the overhead lamps. The noise, the endless pounding, drilling, riveting, became a kind of industrial hymn, echoing across the plains of Michigan. Each day the line grew faster, cleaner, more confident. B-24s moved down the final stretch, like creatures being born in sequence, wings unfolding, engines roaring, wheels touching the concrete for the first time. By the 1,000th unit, the process had become so refined that even visitors fell silent at the sight of it. This was not manufacturing, it was choreography, and as Ford's engineers watched the line flow with unbroken rhythm, they began to grasp what it truly represented. It was not merely a victory of production, it was a new way of thinking about creation itself. Germany still built its planes underground, by candlelight and hand. America now built in daylight, by the tens of thousands, guided not by mastery, but by motion. Each hour gained at Willow Run echoed across oceans. Every efficiency found in Michigan meant fewer sons lost in Europe. The war was no longer being decided in the skies above Berlin, but in the precision of gauges and the timing of conveyors. The assembly line had learned to fly, and in doing so, it was teaching a nation how to fight. But the full scale of what Ford had unleashed was still to come. Because beyond Willow Run, other factories were waiting, ready to copy its rhythm, its logic, its speed. America was beginning to build faster than Germany could destroy, and soon the world would feel the weight of that realization in the skies above Europe. By 1943, the men were gone, drafted, deployed, scattered across continents. In their absence, the gates of Willow Run opened to a new kind of army, one without uniforms, one that marched to the rhythm of machinery. They came by the thousands, clutching lunch pails and work gloves instead of rifles. Housewives, waitresses, farmers' daughters. Many had never handled a wrench before, yet now they stood beneath the wings of bombers, learning to rivet steel. America had sent its men to war and called its women to build it. The transformation was quiet, but profound. At first, supervisors doubted them. The work seemed beyond reach, the weight of the parts, the noise, the precision. But day by day, the factory began to change. Where once stood rows of men, now stood women in bandanas and overalls, hands blackened by grease, faces lit by the white glare of welding torches. They learned quickly, faster than anyone expected. The rhythm of the assembly line demanded not strength, but endurance, and endurance was something they understood. The government called it mobilization. The women called it necessity. At home they had mended, cooked, and endured. Here they learned to shape aluminum and steel. Posters hung above the workstations. "You're building freedom's wings." The slogan was both instruction and benediction. Each plane that rolled down the line carried their labor in its seams, their fingerprints beneath the paint. They would never fly in them, but their sons, brothers, and husbands would. Every rivet was a prayer in metal. Inside the cafeteria, conversation shifted from recipes to production goals. Quotas replaced chores. Friendships formed over shared exhaustion. They worked 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week, often returning home to care for children and aging parents. Some collapsed at their stations from fatigue. Others refused to take breaks. For many, the pay, 65 cents an hour, was the first money they had ever earned for themselves. It was liberation disguised as labor. But liberation was never simple. Prejudice lingered. Male foremen doubted their precision. Veterans called them temporary hands. Yet every hour, another bomber left the line. Every hour, another argument dissolved into evidence. One B-24 every 55 minutes, the fastest production rate in aviation history. The numbers spoke louder than bias ever could. They took pride not in headlines, but in craft. A woman who welded tail sections said, "It wasn't just metal, it was the weight of every man overseas." Another, a widow from Ohio, worked on bomb racks, remarking that her husband's name might one day rest on what she built. Their pride was not boastful, it was steady, silent, and mechanical, a reflection of the work itself. By 1944, more than 1/3 of Willow Run's 42,000 workers were women. The sight of them, helmets on, sleeves rolled, faces streaked with soot, became an emblem of the home front. They were no longer Rosie the Riveter from posters, but real faces in real factories, reshaping both war and society. The line became the great equalizer. Under its relentless motion, gender faded. The only measure was competence, the only goal, the next completed bomber. And as the war dragged on, the women of Willow Run carried not only the weight of aluminum, but of transformation itself. In the roar of engines and the pounding of rivets, they proved that ability was not born of tradition, but of opportunity. Beneath the rhythm of the line, an old world was quietly ending, because when the last bomber lifted off, it carried more than firepower. It carried the proof that the boundaries of labor and of belief had shifted forever. The factory had taught America how to fly. Now it was teaching her how to change. In the heart of Willow Run, beneath the thunder of rivet guns and the hiss of welding torches, another kind of war was being fought, not with bullets or bombs, but with blueprints. Each page, each drawing, was a quiet revolution in the science of mass production. Ford's engineers began cataloging everything: bolts, screws, gauges, paint thickness, every component of the B-24 reduced to a measurable constant. No part was too small to be standardized, no motion too trivial to be timed. They were not merely building airplanes, they were building a system capable of building anything. Before the war, aircraft design had been a matter of pride and secrecy, each manufacturer guarding its blueprints as if they were crown jewels. Ford overturned that tradition. Under Charles Sorensen's guidance, the company opened its files, turning Willow Run's data into a template for the entire Allied industry. Consolidated, North American, and Douglas, competitors in peacetime, now shared one set of specifications, one vocabulary of measurement. What began as a single experiment in Michigan soon became a network stretching from California to Texas to Oklahoma. A wing forged in San Diego could be fitted to a fuselage from Ypsilanti, and both would fly. It was the first time in history that the industrial logic of a single company had scaled to the size of a continent. Trains carried sub-assemblies across the nation, engines from Cleveland, guns from Buffalo, landing gear from Chicago, each arriving at Willow Run with tolerances identical to those produced in Ford's own workshops. A machine assembled in Michigan bore the fingerprints of hundreds of factories, thousands of workers, and a shared language of precision. The blueprints were no longer static drawings. They were a living code. To German intelligence, the reports were incomprehensible. From their perspective, the Allied system appeared chaotic. No central command, no single architect, only a swarm of subcontractors and civilian plants. Yet somehow, out of this apparent disorder, bombers emerged faster than they could be shot down. German engineers, accustomed to hierarchy and craftsmanship, mistook coordination for confusion. They could not see that the chaos had rhythm. They could not see the system behind the noise. In Berlin's analysis rooms, experts pored over captured American documents, trying to understand how a company that once built sedans could orchestrate a national symphony of production. "Where is the genius?" one report asked. "Who designed the master plan?" The answer, ironically, was that there was none. The power of the American arsenal was not invention, but replication. The brilliance lay not in a single mind, but in the system that allowed millions of minds to work as one. Willow Run had done more than mass-produce bombers. It had created the blueprint for industrial warfare, a design that could duplicate itself indefinitely. Every plant that followed carried within it the DNA of Ford's philosophy: division, standardization, synchronization. Even as the war expanded, the system adapted, absorbing new factories and new workers without losing tempo. The arsenal had learned to replicate itself, and as the convoys of bombers rose in growing waves from American runways, their shadows stretching across oceans, the meaning of those blueprints became clear. The weapon was not the B-24 itself. It was the process that built it. Germany had mastered the art of the machine. America had mastered the art of making them multiply. In that realization lay the quiet turning point of the war, because from now on, every innovation, every bomber, every bullet would be born not from craft, but from system, and the system was unstoppable. By 1943, the skies above Europe began to change color, not from weather, but from shadow. The first wave of B-24 liberators, products of the Willow Run miracle, crossed the Atlantic in formations so vast that men on the ground described it as a moving continent. From horizon to horizon, silver wings caught the morning light. The dawn no longer belonged to the sun. It belonged to the bombers. Each aircraft was a geography of collaboration. Engines forged in Detroit, machine guns from Buffalo, glass from Pennsylvania, and fuel pumps from Ohio. What once were separate trades had become one synchronized nation. Every bolt and bracket a gesture of unity. The planes that rose from English fields were not local creations. They were America itself, turned into aluminum and fire. Every hour, another rolled out from Willow Run, steady, precise, relentless. From the assembly line to the airfield, the rhythm never broke. The factory that had once struggled to build a single prototype now produced a fleet before lunch. Engineers spoke of output per minute, not planes per month. It was not a plant anymore. It was an artery, pumping force into the war's bloodstream. Across the ocean, German radar stations tracked the approaching clouds of bombers. At first, they dismissed the numbers as instrument error. "Hundreds of aircraft," one operator reported. "Impossible." But the echoes kept growing. Each week, the formations thickened, stretching for miles, escorted by fighters whose own numbers defied calculation. The German sky, once the realm of the Luftwaffe, had become an industrial corridor of war. The pilots of the Luftwaffe, men who once flew with arrogance and ease, now faced a horizon they could not thin. They dove, fired, and retreated through curtains of flak and tracer, only to find more bombers replacing those they had downed. One colonel, exhausted and hollow-eyed, recorded in his diary, "We shoot one down, 10 replace it. The sky is infinite for them." The machine that had once symbolized American consumerism had become its weapon. Abundance itself turned to strategy. For Germany, the arithmetic of war had inverted. Once the Reich believed it could win through superiority, of technology, of discipline, of will. But superiority meant nothing against an enemy that could multiply. Each B-24 lost was a temporary subtraction. Each new one built was proof that the sum would always favor the Allies. The Luftwaffe still fought bravely, but courage could not compete with capacity. From London to Berlin, the rhythm of industry had become the rhythm of battle. The roar of engines over Europe was the echo of Ford's assembly line. The synchronized hum of 1,000 machines was now the national anthem of a world at war. Germany's pilots looked upward and saw not just bombers, but the embodiment of a system that could not be bombed out of existence. Even under fire, the Americans built faster than destruction could reach them, and yet there was something almost tragic in the perfection of it. The same processes that had once made Model Ts for families now made death from the sky. Each bomber carried 10 men and 5 tons of explosives, but also the memory of the farms, shops, and streets that had built it. To the workers at Willow Run, these machines were symbols of resolve. To those beneath them, they were symbols of inevitability. By the spring of 1944, the Allied air fleet had become a force beyond imagination. Armadas of B-24s blotted out the sun over Bremen, Hamburg, and the Ruhr. The air itself had become a weapon, dense, mechanical, and unending. German cities trembled beneath a rain of bombs, but the true terror lay in the realization that the rain would never stop. Quantity had become invincibility, and in that transformation, from factory line to endless horizon, the nature of warfare itself changed forever. No longer a contest of strength, but of endurance. No longer a matter of who could fight, but of who could build. But in Berlin's intelligence offices, the reports continued to arrive, numbers so large they bordered on the mythical. 42,000 aircraft this year, one cable read. The generals laughed at first, then they stopped laughing, because deep down they knew the war was being lost, not on the front lines, but in the factories, and the numbers would soon tell the story no one wanted to believe. In the spring of 1944, intelligence cables began crossing the Atlantic like whispers of a coming storm. They came through Lisbon, through Stockholm, through the quiet channels of neutral capitals, fragments of information that defied reason. German agents reported on the factories of the United States, their words cautious, their tone almost apologetic. 42,000 aircraft this year, one message read. Production continues at full rate, no evidence of decline. In Berlin, the figures landed on polished desks and were met with laughter. 42,000? It was absurd. Germany's own production, even at maximum effort, would barely reach a tenth of that number. The Luftwaffe's analysts marked the reports as propaganda, British deception, perhaps, or American boasting. To admit otherwise would have been to admit the impossible, that the Reich, the most industrially advanced nation in Europe, had been overtaken by a continent that had once sold tractors and washing machines. But the laughter in Berlin began to fade when confirmation arrived from other sources. Not words, but photographs. Grainy aerial images showed endless rows of factories, hangars, and runways stretching to the horizon, train yards overflowing with crated aircraft parts, parking lots filled with finished B-24s waiting for shipment. The reports were no longer theory, they were testimony. One general muttered under his breath, "They are not lying, they are multiplying." Goering, commander of the Luftwaffe, read the intelligence summaries and erupted. In his rage, he accused his officers of treachery. "Lies, all lies, no nation can produce such numbers." But his fury could not erase what was visible in the skies. Field commanders along the Western Front were sending their own reports of bomber streams that stretched from horizon to horizon, of losses that no longer mattered because replacements arrived before the wreckage cooled. Every day, new formations appeared. Every night, the sound of engines filled the dark. For the soldiers below, the math became unbearable. Anti-aircraft gunners measured success in moments of delay, not in victory. Pilots climbed to meet the bombers, only to find their own airfields destroyed before they returned. Cities burned faster than they could be rebuilt. Civilians whispered to each other as the sirens wailed, "They build faster than we can bury." The truth, by then, had escaped the intelligence offices and entered the conscience of the Reich. It was no longer about espionage or numbers. It was about the recognition of a force beyond reach, a civilization that had turned production into a weapon. In America, factories ran 3 shifts without pause. In Germany, factories moved underground, shrinking to survive. One built in light, the other hid from it. That contrast became the moral geography of the war. In one intercepted cable, a German agent described the scene at Willow Run with disbelief. "They work as if war is a game of arithmetic, not courage." But that was precisely the point. The war of courage had ended. The war of numbers had begun. Every bomber that rose from Michigan represented the triumph of system over skill, of scale over genius. Germany had invested its pride in perfection. America had invested its faith in repetition, and repetition had no limit. By the autumn of 1944, Berlin's analysts no longer argued with the data. They filed it away in silence, understanding that the reports were not forecasts, but eulogies. Intelligence had become prophecy. Disbelief had become doom. The Reich was fighting an enemy it could not exhaust, could not intimidate, could not even comprehend. The war was being lost not in the fields of Normandy or the ruins of Stalingrad, but in ledgers, columns of production figures that no amount of bravery could erase. For every 0-hour strike, 10 new bombers waited on the line. For every factory destroyed, another sprang up behind it. The rhythm of industry had become the pulse of inevitability. The great contest between the craftsman and the conveyor belt was over, and the craftsman had lost. But even as the realization sank in, Berlin's intelligence bureaus continued to send reports, fewer now, quieter, as if they feared to speak the truth aloud. The final cable carried no numbers, no estimates, only a sentence. "They are building victory by the hour." And across the Atlantic, in the bright halls of Ford's factory, that prophecy was already complete. Because in the next year, Willow Run would not only outproduce every factory in Germany, it would redefine what victory meant in the age of machines. By the end of 1944, the world had entered a new arithmetic of power. At Willow Run, the numbers no longer seemed real. More than 8,600 B-24 Liberators had rolled off the line. One bomber every 55 minutes, 24 hours a day. On the surface, it looked like a victory of machines. In truth, it was something deeper, the triumph of a system that turned human coordination into strength. Industrial democracy had outbuilt tyranny. Each liberator that left the factory carried more than engines and guns. It carried an idea that free men and women working in rhythm could surpass the efficiency of compulsion. The workers of Willow Run were not coerced. They were motivated by a purpose that could not be ordered into existence. In the balance between will and machinery, Ford's factory became the embodiment of a new kind of warfare, freedom translated into output. The plant itself had become a monument. Pilots flying newly built bombers often dipped their wings in salute as they passed overhead, a quiet gesture toward the city-sized engine of their survival. From the air, Willow Run looked less like a building than a living geometry, conveyors snaking like arteries, skylights glinting in rows, thousands of cars and buses arrayed outside in disciplined chaos. Inside, the heartbeat of hammers and rivet guns never stopped. It was the sound of a nation in motion. Beyond the Atlantic, the contrast could not have been starker. German production had begun to collapse under the weight of its own fear. Factories moved underground, buried in caverns, disconnected from supply lines. The Reich's workers toiled in darkness, assembling machines that would never see the sky. Allied bombers, often built at Willow Run, now circled over them, the product of one economy destroying the other. It was as if the very concept of industrial order had chosen sides. Ford's engineers tracked their progress with the same precision they once used for cars. Charts on the factory walls showed output curves climbing even as the war raged on. Efficiency rose as material shortages deepened. Riveters broke records. Inspectors passed aircraft at speeds once thought reckless. The line had evolved beyond innovation. It had become instinct. The machinery no longer served the war. It defined it. And still, the irony endured. A man who once built engines for peace had now built the arsenal of victory. Henry Ford, the pacifist industrialist, had outproduced the very empire that once celebrated mechanical domination. The carmaker had outbuilt the conqueror. The vision born in a Detroit garage had reshaped the destiny of nations. By winter, the scale of that transformation was undeniable. Ford's output was greater than all of Germany's surviving aircraft production combined. What the Axis had treated as craftsmanship, the Allies had turned into rhythm. One side built to impress, the other built to endure. And endurance, in the end, was the greater weapon. Historians would later call it the War of Machines, but that description misses the quiet humanity behind it. For every gleaming liberator that thundered off the runway, there were thousands of hands behind it. Hands blistered, oil-stained, trembling from exhaustion. The machines had not replaced men. They had multiplied their reach. The assembly line was not a symbol of dehumanization, but of unification, a collective pulse beating toward victory. As 1945 approached, even the German command understood what had happened. Power had changed hands, not through territory or conquest, but through production. The center of gravity in the modern world had shifted permanently toward those who could build faster than war could destroy. When the last B-24 lifted from Willow Run's runway, its shadow passed over fields once used for farming. In a sense, the ground had come full circle, from soil to steel, from sustenance to strength. The war had taught the world a lesson it would never unlearn, that in the age of machines, victory would belong not to the strongest nation, but to the one that could move in unison. And across the Atlantic, The factories of Germany stood silent, proof that the age of conquest had ended and the age of capacity had begun. In the spring of 1945, the noise began to fade. For 3 relentless years, the sound of Willow Run had been the pulse of a nation. Hammers striking, rivet guns chattering, engines roaring to life. Now, for the first time, the air inside the world's largest factory began to still. The final B-24 Liberator, number 8685, stood gleaming beneath the high skylights, surrounded by the men and women who had built it. As the bomber rolled off the line and toward the open doors, applause followed it like an echo through the hangar's vast, emptying halls. The last engine started, rumbled, and disappeared into the sky. The line that had once moved with mechanical precision simply stopped. Workers remained at their stations for a moment, unwilling to leave. The silence felt strange, heavier than the noise ever had. For years the machinery had given meaning to every hour, every gesture, every life inside those walls. Now, without it, there was only the hum of fluorescent lights and the hollow whisper of air moving through ducts. Men who had never spoken above the din of the factory floor now spoke softly. Women who had carried wrenches and welding masks set them down as if laying to rest something sacred. The war was ending, and with it, the rhythm that had defined them. Outside, a few workers wiped tears discreetly. They were proud, exhausted, and uncertain. Ford's management announced that the plant would soon return to peacetime production. Automobiles again, perhaps, or farm equipment. But everyone knew it would never be the same. Once a building had learned to build bombers by the hour, it could never go back to building cars by the day. The world had changed, and so had they. In a matter of weeks, Willow Run's cafeterias closed, its assembly lines dismantled, its dormitories emptied. The floodlights that had once glowed through the Michigan night were shut off, one by one. Reporters came to photograph the silent hangar, its concrete floors still marked by tire lines, its walls still smelling faintly of oil and metal. For years that smell had meant urgency. Now it meant memory. During the occupation period that followed, delegations from Europe toured American factories, trying to understand the scale that had undone them. Among them were German engineers and captured officers, men once convinced of their own nation's industrial superiority. At Willow Run, they walked quietly, eyes following the length of the empty line, the overhead cranes, the endless roof trusses. One of them, a former Luftwaffe pilot, placed his hand on the cold fuselage of a display aircraft and whispered, "So this is how you fought us." No one answered him. There was nothing to add. The irony was almost too perfect. A factory built by a man who had once despised war had become the decisive weapon of one. A nation that had been unprepared for global conflict had outproduced every enemy that challenged it. The building itself stood as the monument, not to destruction, but to coordination, cooperation, and will. What had begun as farmland had become the forge of modern victory. In the months that followed, Ford converted Willow Run back to civilian work. Cars replaced bombers, chrome replaced camouflage. But to those who had known it at its height, the change felt smaller than the silence that preceded it. They could still hear the ghosts of engines starting, still see the workers in endless rows, still feel the tremor of steel beneath their feet. The noise had been deafening, but it had given shape to purpose. Without it, peace felt almost too quiet. The numbers told a story no one could quite comprehend. Willow Run had produced more bombers than the entire Empire of Japan, more engines than the Luftwaffe could replace, and yet its truest legacy was not measured in machines, but in what it revealed, that democracy, when united, could become the most formidable engine of all. As night fell over the empty plant, The wind moved through the ventilation shafts with a faint metallic sigh, the ghost of motion in a place built for it. For the first time in years, there was no urgency, no command, no alarm, only stillness, and in that stillness, the sound of peace emerged, quiet, vast, and somehow louder than any machine that had ever filled the sky. In the years that followed, historians would search for a single word to define Willow Run. Some called it a miracle, others an anomaly. But to those who had seen it alive, who had walked beneath its cranes and watched its 1,000 hands moving in synchrony, it was something simpler. It was proof that democracy could match the discipline of dictatorship and surpass it, not by fear, but by faith in coordination. At its height, the factory had defied every assumption about free societies, that liberty breeds disorder, that individuality resists command. Yet here, under the Michigan sky, men and women who had never met worked in rhythm tighter than any armies. They shared no ideology but purpose, no obedience but conscience, and through that order, born of choice, they achieved what tyranny never could: unity without coercion. When the war ended, analysts flooded the archives to understand how it had been done. They discovered that innovation, in its truest form, was not invention. It was coordination. The genius of Willow Run lay not in any single machine, but in the choreography between them. It was a symphony of process, conducted not by generals or politicians, but by engineers who believed that repetition could be a form of art. In their world, precision replaced pride, and progress became the most moral act of all. The legacy of that precision spread quietly through the decades that followed. The same principles that moved bombers down the line began shaping peacetime industries. In the car plants of Detroit, in the aircraft hangars of Seattle, in the newly emerging laboratories of Silicon Valley, the rhythm of Willow Run echoed. The methods that had once armed the world now began to connect it. Data replaced blueprints, circuits replaced rivets. The line, in spirit, became the computer. Across the ocean, the irony deepened. German engineers, once masters of precision, now humbled by defeat, traveled to America to study the very systems they had dismissed as crude. They traced Ford's logic, measured his flow lines, and carried those lessons back to the ruins of their own factories. What had begun as imitation evolved into rebirth. In post-war Germany, the idea of efficiency ceased to be militaristic. It became philosophical, the pursuit of order through balance, not control. The defeated had borrowed the logic of their conquerors, and through it rebuilt their world. For the first time in history, the war of machines had become a war of ideas. It was no longer fought with steel or smoke, but with systems of production, of thought, of organization. Nations realized that the greatest weapon of the 20th century was not the bomb or the airplane, but the blueprint of how to make them faster, safer, and together. In that realization lay the quiet evolution of civilization itself. Efficiency, once mocked as mechanical, soulless, and industrial, became the new measure of progress. It was not about speed alone, but about understanding motion, how men and machines could move in harmony toward a shared purpose. The world had learned from Willow Run that even the simplest gesture, repeated by millions, could change the course of history. And so, long after the last bomber left its runway, the factory's true legacy endured, not in its walls or its machines, but in the logic it left behind. The idea that freedom, when organized, could outproduce fear, that coordination, not conquest, could define a century. The war had ended, but the rhythm of Willow Run had not. It lived on, in the hum of assembly lines, the quiet of laboratories, and the code of computers yet to come, because the lesson it taught the world was timeless, that the real frontier of power is not in metal, but in the mind that learns to move it. In the early years of the war, German officers mocked the very idea. "You cannot build airplanes like automobiles," one declared with certainty. To them, the thought was absurd. The airplane was an instrument of precision, the automobile a machine of convenience. One was art, the other utility. Between them stood an ocean of craftsmanship and pride. They laughed, because laughter is the sound of disbelief before understanding, and for a time, they were right. Airplanes could not be built like cars, until America found a way to make it so. Willow Run was not born from theory or arrogance, but from necessity. The old rules of production collapsed under the pressure of war, and in their place emerged something the world had never seen: motion without pause, scale without waste, discipline without tyranny. The factory had become a weapon. Inside its walls, the impossible became routine. Each bomber that rolled out of Willow Run was more than a machine. It was an argument in aluminum, proof that the future belonged not to those who perfected, but to those who multiplied. Every rivet, every seam, every engine told the same quiet truth: that innovation was not the privilege of genius, but the reward of system. What had once been derided as industrial chaos had become the mathematics of survival. German officers who once boasted of craftsmanship now watched their skies darken with its consequence. They had built beauty, America had built abundance. And in war, abundance always wins. The hand-polished precision of Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf met the stamped steel certainty of Ford and Douglas, and the outcome was written not in dogfights, but in production charts. The war was no longer a contest of pilots, it was a contest of factories. As the bombers multiplied, so did the realization. The age of handcraft, the age of the artisan, the master builder, was ending. In its place rose something colder, but more enduring: the age of capacity. Nations would no longer be measured by the genius of their engineers, but by the synchronization of their workers. Power would belong to those who could build not one perfect machine, but 10,000 good ones before noon. It was, in its own way, a quiet tragedy. The craftsman's world was dying, replaced by a world of systems and symbols. Yet within that transformation lay the survival of freedom itself. Because Willow Run did not only build bombers, it built belief. It proved that democracy, often dismissed as disorganized and indulgent, could outproduce empires built on command. Its assembly lines became moral lines, stretching across history. When the last liberator left the factory floor, the laughter that had once echoed in Berlin was long gone. In its place was silence, the silence of comprehension, of respect, even of fear. The men who had laughed now understood that they had witnessed something more than an industrial miracle. They had witnessed a shift in the foundation of civilization. Power was no longer inherited through blood or seized through conquest. It was manufactured. In that shift lay the fate of empires, past, present, and future. From that moment on, wars would be decided not by courage or brilliance alone, but by systems, by output, by the capacity to turn ideas into motion. It was the new arithmetic of power, and Ford had written the first equation. So when historians speak of Willow Run, they do not call it merely a factory. They call it a turning point, the moment laughter became silence and disbelief became doctrine. A place where the modern world learned its defining lesson, that mastery without scale is art, but scale without mastery is victory. They laughed at the factory once. They never laughed again.